Hey, what's up guys? Joker here, and I hope you're all doing well on this terrific launch day for AMD Ryzen Zen 2 as well as the Navi GPUs. In this video, we are going to be focusing on the Zen 2 processors, the 3900X and the 3700X, which I believe are the only two processors that were sampled out to the media. And I'm going to be comparing those against Intel's main competitors, the i9-9900K and the i7-9700K, which match up perfectly in terms of price, even though there's a little bit of a core disparity or hyper-threading disparity, however you want to look at it in some situations there. Price-wise, all these CPUs match up against each other. Well, the 9700K versus the 3700X, 3900X versus the 9900K. So that's what we're going to be focused on here today. We'll be taking a look at gaming performance, temperatures, real-world workloads, and things like Blender, and some synthetic benchmarks as well, so we can get a look at the data on single-core as well as multi-threaded workloads. So I'm not going to waste too much of your guys' time here today before we get into talking about the gaming performance and everything like that, because I'm sure your sub feeds right now are completely obliterated with Zen 2 as well as Navi videos from all of your favorite tech YouTubers out there. But there are a few things that we do need to go over before we get into the numbers, like the test setup and everything like that, and then we'll get into talking about things like overclocking a little bit later on in the video. But for the purposes of this video, I did all my testing on the Intel as well as the AMD CPUs at their stock clock speeds. For my AMD test setup, I was benchmarking inside the Lee & Dynamic O11 case, and both my Intel and my AMD setup were both using Gigabyte Aorus master boards, obviously different chipsets. So Intel was a Z390, X570 for the AMD setup. Both systems were using the same exact kit of RAM, which was 32 gigabytes at 3200 megahertz. I was also running an RTX 2080 Founders Edition, which I did have overclocked in both systems, running on the 430.86 driver from NVIDIA, and both systems were using the same exact water cooler, which was a Fractal Design S36. That's a 360 millimeter all-in-one cooler. And outside of that, as I said, both CPUs were tested at their stock settings, so no overclock on these at all. But I will talk a little bit about clock performance and everything a little bit later on in the video. But right now, I do want to get jumped into the testing, which was all done at 1080p on the high preset in an effort to get us into a more CPU-bound scenario. Obviously, if we were to ramp up resolution, we would find ourselves even more so GPU-bound. So that's really not the purpose of testing on CPUs, which is probably why you're going to see pretty much every reviewer out there testing at 1080p, maybe high ultra settings. Some people might even test down at 720p, as that is just an even better way to kind of see how many frames these processors can actually put out. And even though that might not be necessarily a real-world situation that most of you want to do with these processors, that is the best way to see which one of these processors is actually better than the other. And I do plan to do some more testing at 1440p and 4K throughout the week to, just kind of give that information to people, because that is a more, real-world testing scenario. But today we're just focusing on the actual CPU performance. And if you want to see those other numbers, as I said, they'll be coming a little bit later in the week. In terms of gaming performance, the 3900X and 3700X are both extremely capable processors, able to push out a high number of frames, even though they are operating at a significantly lower clock speed when compared to Intel. Both of them sat anywhere pretty much around like 4.2 to 4.3 gigahertz is what I was pretty much seeing in my Afterburner overlay when I was actually playing video games, and that's basically where they would sit at as well if I was doing any large multi-threaded workload. Somewhere between 4.1 to 4.3 roughly is where they were able to sit. I also did want to mention that for the AMD system, I was using the Precision Boost Overdrive, and then for Intel, I was using their multi-core enhancement. So that is both their kind of like built-in like auto overclocker type of thing, like a boost for AMD and Intel. It's just different names for the different ones, but pretty much accomplishing the same thing at the end of the day. So I did have both of those on for AMD as well as Intel, respectively. And at the end of the day, really what the summation is from all of the gaming performance that I tested was that Intel is still faster in terms of game performance, but their clock speeds at stock are also running a fair bit higher, up around like 4.7 to 4.8 gigahertz. So they run a fair bit faster right out of the box than the AMD processors. But I was not able to get my AMD processors to run as high as like the max advertised boost clock of like 4.6, 4.7 gigahertz. That was just not a number that I was able to hit at all. Like the highest I was able to get on my 3900X just messing around with overclocking a bit, was around 4.4 gigahertz, and it would get extremely hot because it required over 1.45 volts in order to be able to hit that. But these processors in general are running at a higher voltage, which is maybe something we're seeing as a result of 7 nanometer. They just require more voltage to be able to push these processors. But like right out of the box, they're running anywhere from like 1.4 to 1.46 volts on something like the 3900X. So they definitely push out a lot of heat, and I do have some temperature numbers for you guys as well. But first, let's take a look at the average FPS and the 1% lows. Again here, this is with the 2080 on the 1080p high preset for all of the games that I did benchmark. And as you can see, the 9900K and the 9700K are still running faster in almost every single title here. F1 2019 did show a slight advantage to the 3900X over the 9900K, but the 9700K ended up pulling away, which I found to be rather interesting, as the 9700K did really well here across the board. So it almost seems like hyper-threading is actually hurting Intel, something I have not tested in the past, but it does seem like hyper-threading actually can hurt your game performance, as is evident here in this testing, since a 9700K is basically a 9900K without hyper-threading on it. So it's pretty much the same exact thing, yet it actually got a fair bit better performance. That kind of surprised me here, but I did expect to see AMD trailing a bit behind in game performance, but it's still very, very close with the Intel processors. Obviously, if we were able to get a really good overclock and run it up at 4.7 gigahertz, that would probably close the gap here as well. And especially if we were to run at 1440p or 4K, as the resolution goes up, these numbers are going to get even and even closer, something like ultra-wide as well. You're going to see the gap narrow between these different processors, but the takeaway from this is just that the Intel processors out of the box are faster for gaming and able to put out more frames per second, but that does not tell the whole story. Also, we've got 1% lows here. I'll go ahead and leave these up on the screen. If you want to pause and go and look over all of these, you can, but really nothing too different changing from what we just saw with the average FPS. Now, I did mention that temperatures were an issue with my AMD processors, at least the 3900X, not so much the 3700X, but I think that is to be expected. When you are putting two chiplets onto the same package, you're bound to see more heat and more power draw there from something like the 3900X and probably the future 3950Xs when those were released, as my 3900X ran hotter than any of the other CPUs that we tested here, and I'll go ahead and show you those numbers now. This was run on OCCT with small data sets. This was run for an hour to be able to get, the CPU really, really warmed up, and then the idle tests were tested after an hour of letting those CPUs cool down. So that's what you're seeing right here. And as you can see, the 3900X got up to 82 degrees Celsius at the end of that torture test run, and then it was idle at 47 degrees Celsius. And there were times that I did see that temperature come down a little bit, the idle temp, like coming off of a cold boot, I would see it around like 30 to 35. But even after, letting it sit for a while, it still hovered around 47 to 50. Meanwhile, under load, the 9900K only got up to 68 degrees Celsius, and the 3700X was running cooler than the 3900X at 75 degrees, while the 9700K was the coolest running part here at just 60 degrees Celsius. So seeing those temperatures there, it's not hard to figure out why it was a little difficult to overclock something like the 3900X, especially when they are pushing out a pretty high voltage, even at these stock settings right here that I got all these temperatures. I did mention that I was able to get it to 4.4 all cores, but as I said, I had to ramp up the voltage a little bit. And when it was running at that constant voltage all the time, if I were to run a torture test, I would easily see it get over 90 degrees Celsius on the 3900X. And again, that's running on a 360 millimeter all-in-one water cooler inside the Dynamic O11, which has very good airflow, very good layout and all that. So yeah, even with that, I was having some issues in terms of temperature and actually being able to overclock it significantly, and I wasn't even able to get close to the 4.7 all-core. It's not advertised at that, but 4.7 is the boost speed on the box, so I was kind of hoping we'd be able to get that, but I honestly never saw 4.7 gigahertz at any point in time, whether it was on multi-threaded or on a single-threaded workload, which we're going to talk about now. But first up, we'll have a test on running the Blender. This is the BMW test render. It's a demo that you can download off of their website. It's basically just an image and then you render in Blender, and basically the better time in seconds would be the clear winner here. And as you can see, this is where AMD really does start to shine with multi-threaded workloads. As you can see, the 3900X only took 155 seconds in order to be able to render out this image of the BMW, while the 9900K ended up taking 220 seconds. The 3700X was 229, while the 9700K was a full 5 minutes in order to be able to render out the same image. And this is something for someone like me that does video editing. These numbers are incredibly important, because if you are going out and picking up a 3900X, I would hope that you're doing so that you can take advantage of the additional cores and threads, because as you saw with the gaming performance, the 3900X and the 3700X are almost virtually identical. So there is conceivably no reason to go out and buy a 12-core just for gaming. But if you're going to game as well as do multi-threaded stuff, then that is really where it starts to show its advantage, especially when you consider that the 9900K is about the same exact price at $500. However, it's significantly faster, as you're getting an additional 8 threads over what the 9900K can offer. Next up, we've got a few synthetics that we can go over, so we can take a look at the single core and multi-core performance. Here's Cinebench R15. As you can see, multi-threaded workload again. The 3900X is going to completely dominate, but when it does come to single core performance, Intel is the king right there, although it was not as large of a lead in Cinebench R15 as I had expected to see from both of the Intel processors. We've also got the new Cinebench R20 here, where again, 3900X, when you are running all of those cores, all of those threads, that CPU is going to shine and completely decimate anything that Intel has at this price point. Same is true again for the CPU Z benchmark. The 3900X is just absolutely crushing it. And again in Geekbench 4, scoring over 47,000 on the multi-core, while Intel is trailing behind by more than 10,000 when it comes to a multi-threaded workload. So my final conclusion on the AMD 3900X and the 3700X is that they are both incredible processors, both very good, especially when you consider price to performance. Of course, when it does come to gaming and putting out the most frames per second possible, Intel is still going to win at the end of the day. But again, this is a CPU-bound scenario. If you were in a more real-world scenario where you're actually playing games at probably 1440p, maybe even 4K, conceivably resolutions that you would game on if you were going out and spending over $300 or even $500 on a processor, I would hope that you were not going to be playing all the way down at 1080p with a $700 graphics card. You would probably want to go ahead and ramp up your resolution and really be able to take advantage of that. And especially with something like the 3900X, which I explained is so good for doing multi-threaded stuff, whether it be video editing, Photoshop, 3D renders, anything along those lines. If you are a professional in that workspace, you're probably not going to be running a 1080p monitor anyway. You're probably going to be running a 4K monitor, or maybe like an ultra-wide or even a 5K ultra-wide, where the higher the resolution, if you do want to game when you're done working, that the processor is going to matter even less in terms of gaming performance. And if you are running something like that for professional, then that is going to trump out, getting something for actual gaming performance. So that's why I think the 3900X in this lineup right here is definitely the best buy. It's the one that I would personally want to run in my system, because I edit a lot more videos than I do actually gaming, and it wouldn't hold me back anyway in terms of gaming, because I game at 4K, and even on a 4K 120Hz monitor, I wouldn't worry about it losing 2 to 3 FPS to a 9900K, which is probably what we're going to see when we test 1440p and 4K, is that gap of maybe some games it was like 5, 10, maybe even 20 FPS difference. It's going to get closer and closer as we bring up the resolution. So be tuned for later in the week. I'm going to be doing that video. If there's anything else you want to see me test with these processors, let me know down in the comments below. I believe tomorrow I'll be posting a video with all of my gaming benchmarks side by side, so you can guys go ahead and compare that. I'll probably do a separate one for the 3900X and the 9900K, and then another one for 3700X and 9700K. So I'll be putting out a couple of side-by-side gaming benchmark videos with just the raw footage, so you guys can expect to see that. You could expect a little bit more discussion in terms of overclocking later in the week. Of course, we've got Navi performance coming in a couple of days as well. I'll be posting it for you, even though you've probably seen some other numbers already now. I wanted to test on the latest driver, which I said at the start. They only gave us in the last 24 hours, so of course we have to retest Navi all over again, so that's great. So there'll be a bunch more content coming throughout the week. Make sure that you are subscribed for that, and I will see you then for another video. Ciao.